top 5 alt-rock bands that came out before 91, next on Retro Serial. Hey everyone, welcome to this episode where we are talking about the top 5 alternative rock bands that came out prior to 1991 when the alternative rock scene hit. But before we get to that list, would you do me the honor of subscribing to my channel? It would really mean a lot to me. It's a small step for you, but it means so much to us here at the channel. Also, if you want to hit the like button and the bell notification, and share it on your favorite social media. Again, super small steps for you, but they mean so much to us here. I would really appreciate it. If you want to go that one extra step and spend some of your hard-earned cash and donate money to this channel, you can follow the link below to the Buy Me a Coffee page where you can, again, like I said, donate some of your hard-earned cash. One more thing before we get to the list. I just want to be real clear about how I'm defining the term alternative and how I believe it's been traditionally defined up to this point. Because there might be some bands that you're thinking of that should be on the list, but I wouldn't quite consider them alternative, particularly when you're thinking about bands that came out before 1991. So first of all, what I mean by alternative is I mean by a rock band that can't be strictly defined by previously already established genres of music. They might have one foot in that camp, but they can't have both feet in that camp. So for example, they might have one foot in new wave and one foot in pop or one foot in punk. That would be an alternative band, but they couldn't have both feet, let's say, in new wave. And the reason why I bring this up is because there are some bands that have both feet in one camp, but they push the boundaries of that camp, but they're still overall considered to be in that camp. So for example, I would consider The Cure to be one of those bands. The Cure, in my opinion, is definitely still considered new wave, although it pushes the boundaries of new wave, and it is a little bit more punky than new wave. It really only pushes the boundaries of new wave and doesn't step outside that camp enough to be considered alternative rock music, even though it was a great influence on a lot of alternative bands. But again, because I would consider it to have both its feet squarely planted in one previously established genre of music, it can't be considered an alternative rock band, nor can it be considered an alternative rock band if a lot of alternative people drew their influence from it. And that's nothing to say bad about The Cure. They were a phenomenal band, literally one of my favorite bands, heavy rotation, and what I listen to. The other thing I'm not going to count is kind of maybe early alternative bands that were already considered to be super groups. So for example, I would definitely consider REM to be an alternative rock band, one of the earliest, one of the first, but they already achieved that superstardom before 1991, before the explosion of this underground movement. I'm really going to be talking about these bands before 91, before that explosion, that were underground, that had to a degree of following, but were still considered kind of underground, not quite that explosion of popularity bands that were out at that time. So with that said, let's go ahead and get to the list. Coming in at number 5 is Sonic Youth. You knew they would be on this list somewhere. If you're an alternative rock fan, these are pioneers in the alternative rock movement. They define the movement because they came out in 1981 prior to the explosion of alternative rock, of course, but they had this fusion of experimental sound, which was called no wave at the time, and this melodic kind of somewhere between hard rock and soft rock, and that combination really made them an alternative band and definitely influenced bands to come. So for those reasons, Sonic Youth definitely deserves to be on the list. Were you a big Sonic Youth fan? Let me know in the comments section below. Coming in at number 4 is The Cult. The Cult came out in 1983 or 1984, depending upon how you define it. They were a band in 1983, but they didn't settle on the name The Cult until 1984. So whether or not you consider them to be a band, The Cult in 1983, they were certainly The Cult by 1984, but I'll let you debate that amongst yourselves. The Cult is another one of those bands that kind of define the era. And you can see the contrast between somebody like The Cult and somebody like Sonic Youth, who are two totally different bands. But why would The Cult could be considered alternatives? Again, it's that definition that they don't really fit into any one category. They were a heavily blues-based band, but they couldn't squarely be placed in blues because they had a lot of hard rock and to some degree heavy metal influence. And that mix of heavy metal and blues and hard rock and the fact that they weren't like a heavy metal band like Poison or Rat, or even a heavy metal band like, I don't know, like Judas Priest or something like that, it really made them difficult to define. And because their difficulty of definition, that certainly set them in the alternative rock category. I love this band. I still love this band. I think this is one of the best bands during that era. It was one of the bands that I listened to regularly that actually turned me on to alternative rock and kind of started pulling me away from my previous hair metal roots. So did you like The Cult? Let me know in the comments section below. Next on the list, coming in at the number 3 position, is the Violent Femmes. Now I found some conflicting data whether or not they came out in 1980 or 1981. I don't know. I know this. They were a great band, and they still are a great band as a matter of fact. But their self-entitled debut album that came out in 1983 with songs such as Kiss Off, all the songs added up, all those great songs certainly put them in the alternative rock genre because no one could tell if they were punk or if they were a folk band. They were like punk unplugged, which was just unheard of at the time. It was definitely acoustic punk or folk rock punk or something like that. But again, because you couldn't strictly define them in one category, they are taking up a couple of different categories. They certainly belong on this list. One of my favorite bands, heavy rotation. As a matter of fact, I have a quick story to tell you about this band. This was the band that actually turned my attention to other genres of music other than heavy metal. I was sitting in class one day, and I believe I was in 10th grade or 11th grade or something like that. And this girl came to me with, and I was really into music at the time. And this girl came to me with a recorded tape. And, I'd always talk about bands like Motley Crue and Rat and stuff like that I was interested in, Iron Maiden and Judas Priest. And this girl gave me this tape, and she actually sat across from me. We had these little desks that were clumped together in English class. And so we all kind of became friends. And she says, I think you like this band. You should try to give it a try. And so she recorded for me a bootleg copy of the self-entitled Violent Femmes album. And that really started to set my mind down a different trend that would last with me for the rest of my life. So Violent Femmes actually mean a lot to me as a band, turning my attention to more alternative and underground music when at the time that she gave it to me, which was well past 1983. So it was back to like 1989 or 88 or something like that. But love this band, number 3 position. No question about it. What a great band. Coming in at the number 2 position is one of my absolute all-time favorite bands, and that is The Jesus and the Mary Chain, formed in 1983 in Scotland. This band definitely defined what alternative rock is and what alternative rock means. And they continued to put out good albums. They continued to put out albums, in my opinion, that I could almost listen to all the way through, never skipping any tracks or anything like that. As a matter of fact, this brings us after 1991, but it's personal, autobiographical about me. Their album Monkey was one of my all-time favorite albums that I still listen to over and over again. But they came out in '83, and they had some success in '83. I remember their song Head On was in heavy rotation as far as me and my friends were concerned. And they defined the genre because they were, yes, part of the post-punk new wave type crowd, but they also mixed elements of psychedelic rock and also heavy on the punk rock. It was almost like a psychedelic new wave sound that you couldn't quite call them a psychedelic band, and you couldn't quite call them a new wave band, and you couldn't quite call them a punk band. So what did we call them? We called it alternative rock. So they take the #2 position. Okay, before we get to our #1 position, I do have a few honorable mentions. These were bands that I'm sure if you had a list that they would be on somebody's alternative rock list out there. It's difficult at times to make a top 5 list, but these are the top 5 that were my favorite. But of course, there were bands on there that I was just like, I don't know, they didn't have quite the influence on me, but they certainly deserve worth mentioning, and I did listen to them and enjoy these bands a lot. One of those bands was Faith No More. Faith No More was one of the original funk rock groups, which I would say defined the alternative. Was it funk or was it rock? And it was just jammed together. Heavy metal and funk rock jammed together. Loved Faith No More. One of my all-time favorite bands. When that second album that they had came out with Mike Patton on it, man, I wore that tape out. I loved them. The other one was Jane's Addiction. You really can't talk about alternative rock without talking about Jane's Addiction. But although I did like Jane's Addiction, I did listen to Jane's Addiction, they didn't have quite the influence on me personally or quite the rotation that these other bands did. But I didn't want to go, and then the other band probably would be like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, who also defined the era. But those bands didn't quite have the influence on me. And therefore didn't make it on the top 5 list. But again, this is my list of top 5 alternative rock bands that are on my list. So your list might be different than my list. But they are bands who are worth mentioning, and they deserve to be mentioned in a list like this. But they just, for me, didn't make it to the top 5. But great bands in their own right and respect. Okay, coming in at the #1 position, can you guess what it is? Can you guess what band is at #1 for me? Maybe you can, maybe you can't. I won't leave you in suspense. For me, the #1 alternative rock band that came out before 1991, before the explosion of alternative rock, is the Pixies. The Pixies just defined the era. They just defined that 80s alternative rock. As a matter of fact, I can't think of alternative rock in the 80s and before 1991 for sure without thinking of the Pixies. They were a punk band, but they had a pop sound, and they had a little bit more of a clean sound to them than a lot of other punk bands, especially punk bands in the 80s. Like, punk bands in the 80s, like, you can think of your own bands in the 80s. They kind of had a little bit of a more dirty sound, but these guys had a pop sound and a punk sound, and they went from that clean kind of to that actually had a great influence on Nirvana. You know what I'm talking about? The slow and then the coming in with that fast crash. So I love this band. They are definitely in my top 5 favorite bands of all time. They may even be in my top 3 favorite bands. of all time. Now, I do have to admit something here because I'm a little bit of a phony. Okay, I just am. I wasn't one of these people who was always into alternative rock. I was really into hair metal, and I was really into other brands of heavy metal as well, especially in the late 80s. But in the late 80s, I started listening to I was still squarely listening to, Motley Crue and Rat and things like that. But I started listening to more and more of these underground bands coming out. However, I did not get to listen to the Pixies until after the explosion of alternative rock. It's just one of those things that slipped through the cracks. And again, I have a story with this. Somebody came along. It was a coworker of mine, and they knew I was really into rock music, and they gave me a tape, and they were hoping that what I would listen to and what I would like was Porno for Pyros, which I did like. I didn't dislike them at all. But on the opposite side of the tape was Trompe la Mode by the Pixies. And man, I just listened to that. I couldn't believe how good it was. I just listened to that tape over and over again, and I went out and I bought everything of the Pixies. But I was a little bit of a phony. I was, I kind of didn't get into. They came out in 1986, and I didn't get into them until until 1992 or something like that. They just one of those bands that slips through the cracks, but they continue to make good music. Their latest album came out, and even before that latest album, when Indie Cindy came out, after they hadn't been in the studio and released anything for so long, man, Indie Cindy was a phenomenal, phenomenal album. And everyone was like on their edge, like, are they still going to be good after all this time? Are they still going to be good? They weren't good. They were amazing. They were amazing. They still are amazing. Love that band. My number one pick. Even though I technically wasn't listening to them back then, they were still my number one pick for those bands of that era during that time of that genre. All right, so that's my top 5. I'm going to ask you, what were your top 5? And before we go, please do me the honor. I would just be so honored if you would subscribe to my channel. It would mean the world to me. Hit the like button, thumbs up button, share it on your favorite social media. Hit the bell notification if you want to know when these videos come out. And if you want to follow the link below and give us some of that hard-earned cash, it'll lead you to our Buy Me a Coffee page, where you can donate a couple of bucks to see us improve here on the program. Every little bit helps. So until we talk again, let me know what your favorite bands are. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on another episode of Retro Serial.